Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. My name is Marla Orenstein, and I'm the director of the Natural Resources Center at the Canada West Foundation, an independent, nonpartisan public policy think tank based in Calgary. Our mission is to provide practical solutions to tough public policy challenges facing the West and Canada as a whole. I should also mention that I'm a fellow of the Energy Futures Lab and president-elect of the International Association for Impact Assessment. Over the last few months, really starting around November of 2020, the federal government has come out with a flood of new legislations, regulations, and action plans relating to energy and the environment. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what most of these are, but I think they're worth a review. First, because there was a lot that was dumped in a very short period of time, but also because they're interesting to consider in their totality, really, as a package. So over the next 18 minutes or so, I want to do a quick review of 7 things that you should be aware of. The first being Bill C-12, the net zero bill, the carbon tax, the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy Strategic Plan, the Small Modular Reactor Action Plan, our new National Hydrogen Strategy, the Clean Fuel Standards, and Bill C-15 for UNDRIP. So first, let's start with Bill C-12, which is the Net Zero Act. The bill sets a target of net zero for the country as a whole by the year 2050, with interim targets set for milestone dates between now and then, 2030, 2040, 35, 2040, et cetera. Bill C-12 doesn't describe the how of how the country will reach its targets, just the how much of what those targets are. So the significance is really that it sets the overarching framework that all the other legislation and regulations and plans and strategies and everything else falls under. So that's the Net Zero Act. The second is the carbon tax. I'm sure you've heard about this. You had to have been living under a rock not to hear about it. It increases the carbon tax quite a lot. Again, it announced in December. And the announcement at that time said that the carbon tax is going to be rising to $170 a ton by the year 2030. And in terms of how the government arrived at that figure, this was set based on modeling that identified $170 as the magic number that would be needed to stimulate the action that would meet that net zero target. The third is the Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy Strategic Plan. So the acronym for this is HEHE. I've heard some people call it the HE plan. You can decide for yourself if that's appropriate or not. This is a whole of society plan that was put forward in December. It describes exactly how all sectors are going to work together to help us jointly achieve this net zero goal. The energy sector for sure, but also agriculture, manufacturing, the built environment, transportation, the public sector, all of it. The plan also came with the announcement of a suite of programs that the government will support with $15 billion. I was actually really happy to see this strategy published. Most of what the government has put out before this relating to emissions was really piecemeal and focused almost entirely either on vehicles or on the industrial sector. This is the first time that the government has put forward something that's really comprehensive and addresses all the moving parts across all of society. So whether or not you approve of the contents, I think it's hard to argue that it's not helpful to see it all laid out in black and white. One part of the HE document that hasn't gotten much attention, but I think is significant, is the promise of a national infrastructure assessment to help identify needs for reaching that net zero future. I think this assessment is desperately needed. The scale of the change that we're looking at over the next few decades means that we need to be planning for the support of infrastructure now, the transmission lines, the pipelines, all the bits and pieces that we need to actually get there, especially when we see how long it's taken major infrastructure projects to get through the project approval process over the last decade or so. And I personally am hoping that the assessment won't just be a review of the physical infrastructure pieces. I'm hoping that it will also take into account the context and what we need there. So, for example, the regulatory environment and how well that's positioned to be able to rapidly deal with new infrastructure. So that's one piece of the HEHE document that I think warrants more attention. So far we've got the net zero bill, the carbon tax, and the HEHE plan. Now on to the small modular reactor action plan, or SMR action plan. Small modular reactors are really making some exciting developments in terms of the technology. Even in the last 5 years, advancements have been made that have progressed more rapidly than anyone foresaw. This action plan lays out the next steps for the development, demonstration, and deployment of SMRs for multiple applications at home and abroad. And it would see the deployment of SMRs by the late 2020s, which is really fairly ambitious. The government has put together 109 partners on this action plan and outlined the part that each of the 109 will play. The provinces are included where they wanted to sign on. And oil sands companies are also either directly involved. I know Suncor was one name that I noticed on the list, or indirectly involved through the participation of COSIA, who's also one of the partners. The action plan also lists 450 action items. These range from the very large, like overhauling the regulatory regime to be sure that it's ready, to more targeted and focused action items like ensuring that there's diversity in the nuclear workforce. So the SMR action plan is really interesting. It's still also quite risky. This is because SMRs aren't a sure thing. There's research going on globally, especially in the US, the UK, Russia, and China, but there's no functioning SMRs really up and working, and it's not 100% sure that there really ever will be. My hunch is that the government is positioning Canada to not just use SMRs domestically to decarbonize, but for Canada to become global leaders in SMR provision. And that's where some of the risk comes in. It might be a good bet that we're going to need nuclear energy. It is, after all, low carbon or zero carbon. It's good for a lot of different applications. It works in many different contexts. But even if we get our act together, getting regulatory approval in the countries in which we want to sell SMRs is going to be a long, slow process. So it's a bet, it's a risky bet, it's probably a good bet, but it is something that's going to take probably several decades to really play out. The next is the National Hydrogen Strategy. Hydrogen has huge momentum right now. There's about 16 or 17 different countries that have an explicit on-paper hydrogen strategy, and another half dozen at least that are in the works. And now Canada has one as well. So the early focus in the plan is on blue hydrogen, that is hydrogen produced from natural gas with the carbon dioxide being sequestered. The longer term focus is on green, where it's created from renewable energy. I have a lot of questions still around the hydrogen strategy, even though I'm glad that it is there. My biggest one is whether the government is serious about hydrogen as an export opportunity, or just whether it's intended to meet domestic demand. And if we're selling it for export, and we should, because there's a huge market developing for this, how are we going to move the hydrogen, given the incredible problems we've had in building infrastructure to move other energy products? This is not answered at all in the hydrogen strategy. And some of the statements in the strategy lead me to think that the federal government's being a little bit naive about the roadblocks that the approval process is actually going to throw up. Just because it's hydrogen in the pipelines doesn't make it an easy pass for anybody. So we'll see. I'm hopeful but cautious on this one. Someone, or maybe a lot of someones, are really going to be winners in the hydrogen space. Let's hope it's Canada. Next up, the Clean Fuel Standard, or CFS. This is something that's taken up a lot of airtime in the last 2 years or so. So let's start with what it is. The Clean Fuel Standard is going to require fossil fuel suppliers to gradually decrease the carbon intensity of liquid fossil fuels. Carbon intensity refers to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are released along the full life cycle, from production to consumption, or from well to wheels, if you prefer, of a given volume of fuel. Quite a few people are confused about the difference between the carbon tax and the Clean Fuel Standard, whether the CFS is really just another carbon tax or another money grab, and whether it even makes sense to have a Clean Fuel Standard given that we have a carbon tax. I believe that it is. They really do different things. The carbon tax is designed to change consumer behavior. By making fuel more expensive, the government hopes that consumers will purchase less fuel or will switch to lower carbon options. The CFS, on the other hand, makes the fuel that is used less carbon intensive. So the CFS achieves reductions directly without the need for consumers to change their behavior. And I want to offer an analogy that's been working for us fairly well. It's like a liter of gas is a piece of pizza and the country is on a diet. The carbon tax makes the pizza more expensive, so we'll buy less of it. The clean fuel standard turns it into a low-fat pizza so that even if we eat the same amount, we've consumed fewer calories. As you probably heard, there were some big changes announced to the clean fuel standard in December. The biggest of these has to do with what fossil fuels it will apply to. Originally, it was going to be all types of fossil fuels, whether it was solid or gaseous or liquid in form. After December, this was reduced, so it's only going to be liquid fuels, which are primarily gasoline and diesel with a bit of heating oil and a few other things thrown in. This was a really good change in my mind. There's a lot of reasons that it's a lot more complex to implement this for solid and gaseous fuels, and the return was actually much less certain. I should also add that fuels that are produced and exported are exempt, which is actually quite a lot of our fuels. It's going to apply now just to liquid fuels and also to only those ones that are consumed within Canada. In December, the government also changed the carbon intensity reductions. So now they are lower to start with. They are still going to increase over time, but actually the upper end where it finishes in 2030 is higher than it had originally been slated to be. So that was another change. Another thing that's happening, this wasn't a change, but it's an important piece to remember, is that the CFS is going to replace the renewable fuel regulations, or RFRs, in the sense that for red tape, you need one piece of regulation in, one has to go out. What's going out is the renewable fuel regulations that stated that there has to be a minimum low fuel content of 5% for gasoline and 2% for diesel, sorry, low carbon fuel content. This content requirements is still being maintained, but now the regulation that will house them is no longer the RFR regulation. It is now under the clean fuel standards. Another important change that did take place in December is now there's a very clear exemption for own use fuels. So fuel suppliers that consume some of the product that they produce for their own operations, that fuel itself will no longer be subject to the clean fuel standard. I could go on about a lot of the details for quite some time. It's really complex. It's really confusing. It took us about a year and a half to figure out what was going on, but I will not go on about it. I'm happy to answer any questions about it, however. Instead, I want to wrap up with the last item on my list, which was Bill C-15, which is UNDRIP, which stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Many people know UNDRIP for the statement that says Indigenous peoples should have free, prior, and informed consent for projects to take place on their lands. And a lot of people have been worried about the implications of this. UNDRIP, however, is much, much broader, and most of it concerns completely other things. It concerns rights around assembly, recognition, belonging, freedom of speech, etc. If you read the original UNDRIP document put out by the UN, it's really hard to take issue with any of the aspirational goals it sets out. So you may remember that back in 2018, there was a private member's bill introduced, Bill 262, I believe it was. That was introduced and it failed. This new bill, Bill C-15, is a little different in some key ways and much better in my mind. Bill C-262 would have made UNDRIP Canadian law. I mean, that's really what it says, is UNDRIP shall now be Canadian law. This is very problematic because it gave us two competing sets of laws and no easy way to reconcile the two. This new bill, however, Bill C-15, the one that's up now, says that Canadian law will be reviewed over time to make sure that it is consistent with the intention of UNDRIP. So that's a big difference between UNDRIP is Canadian law versus Canadian law will be reviewed to make sure that it's consistent with the intentions. According to the federal government, it doesn't change the duty to consult, nor does it create new obligations or regulatory requirements for industry. However, I wouldn't expect anything to happen too soon, even if the bill passes. The first obligation it sets out is to develop an action plan in consultation with Indigenous peoples and other federal ministers, If the bill passes, the government has 3 years to prepare that plan. However, the government also has a history of not moving terribly quickly on issues related to reconciliation and rights. So maybe we can check back in a few years on this one and see where it's actually gone and has it passed and what's actually happened. So that's it for me, a quick roundup of 7 important federal pieces of legislation regulations. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope we have a chance to speak in person at some point.